Hello, everybody, and welcome to NCTE on Air. We're happy to have you join us tonight as we talk about NCTE's Assessment Story Project. Throughout this podcast, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions if you like via the question and answer app that should be showing up on your screen. I can see those answers on my side, and we'll be taking questions from the audience as well as asking some questions of our guests. My name is Jenna Fornell. I work with the National Council of Teachers of English, and it is my great honor to be joined this evening by Kathi, Yancey, and Kathryn Pierce, who are going to talk to you about what the assessment project is all about, what we're doing with that, and also talk to you a little bit about their experiences with assessment. Throughout this chat, you can also chime in and participate via the Twitter hashtag NCTEOnAir. So there will be a discussion happening on Twitter at the same time, and that's also a space where you can ask questions. Thank you for joining us tonight, and without further ado, I would love my guests to introduce themselves.
So Kathryn, you want to start?
My name's Kathryn Mitchell-Pierce. I'm a 6th grade literacy teacher in the Midwest. I've been there about 12 years, and prior to that, I spent about 10 years teaching in the elementary school in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, and prior to that, I taught at the university level.
And I'm Kathi Yancey, and I teach at Florida State University in the Rhetoric and Comp program in the Department of English. And if we're going to do the backward journey, before I was at Florida State, I was at Clemson University. Before I was at UNC Charlotte. And a very long time ago, I was a middle school teacher and taught 8th grade in Washington County, Maryland.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you both of you for being here tonight. Tell me a little bit about what the Assessment Story Project is. How did this come about, and why is it something that NCTE is doing at this time? Kathi.
Sure, that's a great question. So last summer, the presidential team and the executive committee of National Council of Teachers of English, being very aware that assessment and testing in particular has been something that teachers are concerned about. And also being aware that this spring in particular, in the spring of 2015, we would see the first wave of some new tests that are associated either with Common Core state standards or with Common Core state standards lookalikes in states that haven't formally adopted them but that are moving in the same direction. The state I live in, Florida, is one example. And given that awareness, they formed a task force, and Kathryn and I served in that task force. And our purpose was really to think about messages that we wanted to share with the public at large about assessment, about the difference between classroom assessment and standardized testing. And as we developed those materials, it became pretty clear that we didn't actually know from the voices of teachers about the impact of standardized tests or on the teachers or on their students. So you've got lots of people in policy circles, some of whom may have seen a classroom at some moment in time, many of whom have not ever actually inhabited a classroom, who are talking in very interesting ways about what assessment looks like in the classroom context, but nobody has ever asked the teachers. It was a rather large oversight, to put it as kindly as one might, and so we decided that we would. And that was the birth of the NCTE Assessment Story Project. On the one hand, it's a very small kind of effort. It's a set of survey questions that are pretty straightforward. They're all free response. That is to say, we want to know what teachers think, so we haven't scripted the answers. And I'll also say that we don't have a particular brief on this. We didn't decide what we wanted to hear first and then ask questions to solicit that. We really want to know. If all the respondents had come back and said, you know, standardized tests are great. I've never been able to teach as I can now, then that's what we would be sharing. That is not actually what we found. Let me hasten to add that very quickly. But the point was to learn from teachers themselves about the impact of assessment on their teaching, on kids' learning, and also to learn from them about how they use assessment. What's their understanding of assessment, and about their ideas about how things might be better. And that is the Assessment Story Project. At this point, we literally have hundreds of responses. and we're optimistic that we'll get hundreds more by the time we're done.
I was wondering, Kathryn, if you could tell me a little bit about what you've noticed from those responses so far. Kathy said that you have hundreds of them. Are there any trends that are emerging or things that you're noticing? And I'd also be curious to hear if you're getting responses all from kindergarten all the way through college, or if they're concentrated in a particular area.
I'd love to share. It's been a true pleasure to be able to read through the stories that we've received up to this point, and anybody who's listening, I urge you to go to the NCTE website and click on the link and add your voice to the conversation by responding to the questions. Teachers have a lot to say about assessment, and as Kathy said, up to this point they haven't really had a place to speak up about their own perspectives on this. The things that they're sharing, oftentimes it's examples of the ways they assess their students all the time, particularly those really crucial observations and interactions that seem to have been slighted in the current conversation about standardized tests and broad-scale controlled testing and things like that. That in some ways it's almost as if those crucial observations and interactions have been marginalized, and the Story Project allows us to bring those back to the center so we can talk about those as well. Teachers talk so far, what we've read, and they're talking a lot about the value of working with their colleagues and wishing that they had more time to do that. They find the conversations with their colleagues very valuable. It helps them get a new perspective on the data that they've gathered on their own students, and it raises the level of understanding of both the literacy and learning processes, and also it raises or expands the repertoire of teaching strategies that teachers have available to them. Many of the respondents, but not all of them, many of them would like to get rid of standardized tests. And those who do want to get rid of them, they say it's because of the inordinate amount of time it takes, the disruption and the ongoing teaching and learning that usually takes place in their classrooms, and the significant expense of paying for the tests and also the technology infrastructure necessary to do the tests. And they're wondering what's the payoff in return for all that money that's invested. Teachers commented that they feel like they know pretty much who's doing well and who's struggling in their classrooms just based on their interactions and the day-to-day assessments that they do in their ongoing work. And usually the results don't come in time to help the teacher work with the students they have now. Oftentimes the results come after those students have moved on to another teacher or another grade level or even another building. And when the results do come in, the format is not helpful for planning instruction. There are some teachers who say it does help them give an overall view of how their curriculum is working, but it seems like a lot of time and money spent for just a small bit of information of that type. Some of the teachers responding have very well developed ideas of what they'd like to do instead of standardized tests. Everyone, I think, that we saw in the survey responses we've seen so far acknowledge that we all want to be able to answer the question, how well are our students doing? And so the alternatives include very keen interest in portfolios as a way to actually document the richness of what's happening in learning classrooms and to be able to show learning over time, and instead of that one-shot snapshot, to be able to give more of a video view of kids learning over time. Also some mention of school team visits where teachers visit, teachers, administrators, parents, community members visiting schools and giving their observations about what they see and offering some comparative comments, similar to walkthroughs that many teachers are now familiar with. And then also the idea of a community learning fair or a community museum where the community is invited to come in and see evidence of student learning. Teachers have lots of stories about individual students whose assessment data just does not line up with what they know about their students on a day-to-day basis in their classroom, and they're frustrated that decisions are made for plans for those students when they know that the data don't represent what they see on an ongoing basis.
That's a lot. I mean, that's a tremendous variety of findings that have emerged from these stories. And I'm wondering, Kathy, is there anything that you've observed that you would add to that? Oh.
Kathy, hang on a second. I think you're muted.
Yep.
Unmute?
There you go. You're good. Yep, you're perfect.
Okay, sorry. There was a story by one teacher who talked about how she had looked at the standardized data that had been shared with her, and she compared it with her own assessments, and she found that, in her words, that there was an 85% correlation, positive correlation. And the question that she raised had to do with why we needed standardized tests, if in fact her own assessments were showing what it was that she needed to know. And her assessments allow her to meet the needs of students at their point of need, which is a radically different approach than having an assessment that may provide you with data in the year you're teaching and may not provide you with any data at all. So it was very interesting that she's doing already what needs to be done. And it counts. Now, it counts for learning, but it doesn't count in the larger scheme. There were reports from teachers at the college level who say that they basically have to help students unlearn what they understand about writing as they enter college because their writing is so informed by a test. There's no sense of writing process, and that didn't surprise me. We've done some research at Florida State where students come to us and their notion of writing is what they call FCAT writing. So the test has become the curriculum. If it's not a test, they don't understand it. And that's a different kind of problem. Another thing here that was interesting, it seemed to me, was that there was this sense that teachers actually had to work around the tests. You know, the tests are, according to people who advocate for them, supposed to help teachers. But if teachers understand that their purpose is to help students learn, the tests seem to get in the way of that. They're an obstacle. So that learning to get you around the test. So that's interesting because what it means is that what's happening with the tests is diametrically opposed to what the people who are running the tests think is happening. It would be great to put these people in the same room and have them talk to each other because I think, you know, let's assume that the test makers are do what they think is right. Then they need to hear from teachers because what we're hearing from teachers is that those intentions are not being satisfied at all. And in fact, they're counterproductive. They're counterproductive in terms of students learning. Teachers talked a lot about the unintended consequences of testing. Something that I started thinking of in terms of collateral damage. You know, collateral damage is something that happens that is just the price you pay for something you do. The collateral damage here in some ways is students' attitudes. They get completely demoralized.
Hmm.
There's all this actually when you read from a kindergarten teacher about how she's trying to prepare her kids to take a test. It really puts a totally different spotlight on what's happening in education. So those were some of the kinds of things that I found in looking at the data.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just having a conversation with someone about who's also part of this assessment story project, and we were talking about this interesting disconnect between the standards in whether or not you're using Common Core standards or your state has a different set of standards. All of the standards right now in the K-12 arena are supposed to be preparing students to be college and career ready. But then the story that you just shared about what you've observed with your students who are coming to you at college, it doesn't sound like these assessments are actually accomplishing that. They're not really getting them college and career ready. They're just getting them ready to be able to take the test.
And actually there was a story from who taught in class where 50% of the students were misplaced on the basis of a standardized test. So the test isn't even doing what it needs to do. There was a story from a high school teacher who talked about looking at some test results from her kids. When she looked at them, she thought that really the only trouble that the kids really had was literally with commas. And so she worked with the kids to help them be sure that they understood commas. And then they took a test again, and the test results were great. Well, so if that's the case, what it means is that that test is not actually a test of writing, it's a test of commas. And that's another problem, which is there's something called the construct of writing. And what that means basically is your definition of writing. How are you defining writing? Well, if you define writing as punctuating properly, that's a radically different definition of writing than assuming that you can, for example, write a narrative that will go to high school kids, or you'll write a research project that will go to an audience at large. That's a very different conception of writing. And what she was suggesting was that the ability to use commas, was subbing for the ability to actually write. And that happens with too many tests, which is a different problem. So what it means is that the data that you're getting actually misdiagnoses the problem. And that's just another problem. We could, the list is long.
Yeah, for
we
sure.
See similar issues in assessments of reading, particularly for younger students, where the assessment is billed as a comprehension assessment. What they're really assessing is the ability to define words, or to build analogies, or to fill in the blank in a closed procedure. And the passages are so short that students really aren't given an opportunity to demonstrate that they can construct meaning from text. But because it's labeled a comprehension test, people are using it as if it is indeed assessing student comprehension.
Huh. All of these stories that you're sharing kind of address my next question, but I wonder if there are others that emerge in this context. Assessment is a huge hot topic right now. We're seeing it every day in the newspapers, states that are opting out, what's working, what's not working with these standardized tests that are in full swing. So there's a lot that the public can read about assessment right now, but are there things missing from that public conversation that you wish you could infuse into that conversation from these stories that you're reading? And maybe some of the examples you've given would be part of that.
I mean, I would say yes. One of the things that interested me, and this was a common theme throughout, from the teacher's point of view, the respondents who have shared their stories, there are a couple of things that are interesting. First of all, they draw a very clear distinction in assessment. Testing is something that's external, it's designed by somebody else, it's intrusive, it's interruptive, and it doesn't, for most of the respondents, I mean, as Kathryn said, there are one or two who said, actually this is fine and things are going well, but for the other hundreds, they were quite clear that testing was not helpful. It was something they had to work around. Now, at the same time, they really value assessment. I mean, there's an untold story here. What I thought of as something of a silent revolution, in the sense that I think there's a perception that teachers don't actually know very much about assessment. And one thing that became very clear, or has become clear, and I think may continue to become so, is that teachers, A, know a lot about assessment, just as a general matter. We put these questions to them, and if you didn't understand something about assessment, you would have struggled with them. Nobody's struggling, okay? They understand assessment. They understand how assessment works in their classrooms with their kids. They understand how to use it. I don't think the public sees that at all. I have a nickel that says that there are some principals that see that there are some district leaders that see that. But as a general matter, and I will bet you that there are some parents who see this, okay? So I'm not saying that there aren't pockets of insight here, but I think as a general matter, the public thinks that teachers are kind of benighted in this area. They don't know very much about assessment, and if they got smarter, they would understand that these assessments are really helpful. And honestly, that's not at all what the data show. Would you agree with that, Kathryn?
I would, and I think one of the other parts of that conversation that's not being included is that cost-benefit analysis. We're spending a lot of money on the tests and on the infrastructure to administer the tests, and what teachers are crying for is money spent on time to collaborate with their colleagues around the data they already have about their students to use that to plan and revise and critique the learning experiences they're offering in their classrooms. And when I look at small rural districts, even here in my state, who are redirecting large sums of money from professional development and curriculum development into the purchase of tests and the purchase of technology to administer the tests, it kind of gives me a queasy feeling, because that money could really be well spent in areas that would have a direct impact on student learning rather than on the external assessments. And I agree that we need to be able to answer the question, how well are our kids doing?
Oh, yeah.
And I think conversations between teachers and other stakeholders can answer those questions in satisfying ways. And that maybe occasionally you would drop in and look at a broad-scale assessment like the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is why that was put in place. But I don't think we need to have this constant testing of every child to know, in general, how things are going.
Do you think that part of what I'm also hearing in your analysis of this disconnect is not only that the public doesn't think that teachers understand assessment, but also maybe that the public doesn't understand teaching, doesn't understand what teaching is about? I wonder if that's a flip side to this, because I feel like in what you're saying, Kathryn, I think the public perception is we have to do these tests all the time, because otherwise how are teachers going to have any idea what their kids are doing? How will they actually know what they're doing? And that to me illustrates this sort of like black box of teaching. Like you put kids in there and you close the door and something happens and then learning comes out, but I don't really know what actually is happening inside.
I think that's what I call the movie theater teacher syndrome, that people think that teachers are people, they walk in, they deliver a set curriculum to a pack of students, they collect the multiple choice or bubble in at the end of the lesson, and they've taught the lesson, they've taught the curriculum, and the students are now learning or not learning. And those TV and movie images of teachers, I think, are driving the way the public sees education. But if the people who are spending time in their own child's classroom, they feel very comfortable with how their own children's learning is taking place. Maybe they're judging other schools and saying those schools are having a teaching learning issue or performance or achievement issue, but not my school. I'm happy with my school. And that's because those teachers know their kids inside out and backwards. They're collecting data on their kids all the time. They can talk knowledgeably to the parents of those students and say, I noticed your child was doing this at the beginning of the quarter, and now several weeks later, look at the progress that we're seeing. And those subtle indications of learning progress don't show up on a broad-scale standardized achievement test. They show up when you look repeatedly at samples of student work, at observations of students over time, and looking and just having conversations with students about their learning. And I think those more sophisticated ways of assessing students are devalued because they come free with a teacher's salary.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. And I think another part of it is that often parents and the public at large base their own understanding of what works and what doesn't work on what worked for them. So just as an example, I remember when our kids were young in an elementary school, at one moment they were engaged in a new math curriculum that involved a lot of manipulatives and a lot of process. And so literally kids were adding 2 and 2 and getting 5. Well, my husband is, has a background as an engineer, and it's fine if you want to teach process writing and they make a few mistakes there, but you don't want to make a mistake in math. I mean, we know 2 and 2 doesn't equal 5. And, he's a very active and involved parent, but he was sort of beside himself. And I said, really, if you'll just come in the classroom and see what they're doing with this is part of a teaching process. Well, he did. Story turned out fine, and actually our son is a mathematician, so either things turned out well or the world's in trouble. But the point here is that there are new methods of teaching and new methods of assessment that parents and the public at large do not understand. They understand tests because we've had standardized tests of this variety for, it's about the 100th year anniversary, actually, in terms of when they, yes, in terms of when they were created. We're coming up on the 100th year anniversary. So they know this. This is, you know, and it's, I remember one time when I was in Charlotte talking to somebody who was a leader of the PTA, and again, it was around testing, and I said, you know, the tests that you're so in favor of are not going to show you how well kids can read or write. And she said, I mean, to her credit, she said, well, they probably won't, but this is all I know. Mm-hmm. And that stuck with me. So there's, I mean, it's not fair. It's not fair that as teachers we have to do more than work with students in our classroom. But there is a larger educational program here that I think the NCTE Assessment Story Project is part of, which is helping people understand what teaching looks like, not standardized testing, but what assessment looks like, and supportive teaching, and how we make that work, and how actually you can make that work with other large-scale efforts like the National Assessment of Educational Progress that Kathryn mentioned. Teachers are not afraid of accountability. They're not afraid of being responsible for their students. Again, they've been responsible for their students. They were yesterday, they are today, and they will be tomorrow. They do not come and go. They actually stay, you know, with the project. But we could move to a model that was much lighter in terms of the gathering of information for other kinds of purposes, and much heavier on what we know supports kids.
You know, Kathy, it was interesting, too, when we looked through the stories we've received so far. There were a number of teachers who said, I have a well-established assessment system in my classroom of observations, interactions, pre-tests, exit surveys, just a wide variety of ways that they collect information on how their students are doing, and they see those as assessments and they value them. We also had a number of teachers, when we asked them what would be an alternative to a standardized achievement test, and many of them said, I don't know, but I'm looking for it. And I think in addition to having you know, a PR and education opportunity for families and community members, I think we have teachers who are hungry for alternatives to the standardized tests that may be in their own school district where they teach, that may be the only option they've been afforded. And if they have very narrow commercial and prescriptive curriculum materials that comes with lots of testing that looks like standardized testing, some of them who've grown up as teachers in those systems have never had the opportunity to experience an alternative. And I think groups like the National Council of Teachers of English are in a great position to offer support for teachers and say, here's some ways to get started on conversations to build alternatives that work within your school and your community.
Yeah, there was a quote that I saw from one of the respondents today that really struck me, and I wonder how you how you guys would feel about this statement. She said, the problem is not with literacy assessment. The problem is with our assessment literacy. Mm-hmm. And if we don't understand the tools that we're using or why we're using them, then it's very difficult for them to be effective.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and I think another place where I think as the National Council of Teachers of English we could have a productive influence is to offer information to administrators at the building and district level to help them understand what those standardized achievement tests that they've been spending lots of money on, what information those tests can provide, but more importantly, what information they cannot provide. And we heard lots of stories of teachers where those assessments are being used for purposes for which they were never intended. And so I think we can offer some guidelines about do's and don'ts of using standardized achievement data and help them understand when you do crazy things with statistics that aren't statistically valid, that you end up thinking that you know something about the learning in your building or your district when in fact you're just sort of playing with numbers.
I was wondering, it's clear that this is something that you both care a lot about, but I was wondering if you could share with our audience a little bit about why. What is your personal investment in this issue, and why is it something that you've taken an interest to in your own professional life?
Can you repeat that, because I didn't hear you?
Sure. Sorry.
I lost you.
So basically, what is your personal investment in this issue? Why are you interested in assessment?
Oh, well, oh gosh, that's a great question. You know, there are many ways I could come at it. One narrative is that got lost. Just got lost. Did you hear it? Can you still hear me?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. Right. So when I was in graduate school, my dissertation director actually did a lot of work in what back in the day was called tests and measurements. So it wasn't called assessment then, and honestly, it wasn't even called evaluation then. It was really tests and measurements, and I took a course in tests and measurements, went over to the College of Ed and took a course there because I think how we establish value really interested me. That was part of it. But the second part of it was that I went to Purdue to graduate school, and at that time, there was a testing center, testing center for writing, actually, that was adjacent to a writing lab. And so what would happen, there were different populations of students who had to meet a writing requirement. There were a couple ways they could meet it. One way was by passing this test. And when they didn't pass the test, they literally walked through the door and came to the writing lab to get help, so that then they could go right back through the door and take the test. Well, I worked in both the writing lab and the testing center for the length of my graduate career at Purdue, and there were a couple of things that were very, very interesting to me. One was that the test score, and I was involved in the scoring system. It didn't actually tell you what you thought it would tell you. So I'll give you a classic example. You would get and they were writing something. They had a prompt. They would write something. They had 3 hours. They had a generous allotment of time, and so on. But when you look at it, you would see a piece of writing, and you'd say, you know, this writing is very badly organized. So the student apparently doesn't understand how to organize a paper. So you would think, well, that's where you would spend your time and energy. Yeah, actually, that was incredible. 9 times out of 10, that was misleading. What the student really didn't understand was invention. They didn't have any pre-writing strategies. Since they had no pre-writing strategies, they had nothing to organize. That was really what the problem was. So first thing I learned is that any test that you get is only a sample of behavior, and it is easy to misinterpret the results. Okay, in ways that are actually harmful. These have material consequences. They didn't meet this requirement, they were not going to get a college degree. This is not a small thing; it's high stakes. So that was one thing. The second thing was that as a classroom teacher, I was also teaching at that time, I had already moved to a portfolio system in my classroom. And I moved to a portfolio system, and this is, it sounds improbable, but it's true. My language for my doctorate was German. And so you could either pass a test or you could take the course. And I'm not just going to pass the test, so I took the course. And I took the first test, and I got an F. And I knew this was bad. This was very bad. So I went to see the teacher, who was a very good teacher, and he showed me exactly what I was getting wrong. He really knew how to target patterns of error. And the next test I got a C. The next one I got a B. The next one I got an A, and I thought, whew, okay, good. I'm going to pass this test. The great thing was that on my transcript, I got an A. And I thought, how could I get an A? You average the grades. I started with an F, and I went up, so I should have gotten like a C plus maybe. And then it occurred to me that that's exactly what we do in writing. And that really, you should give a grade or a score that shows a student's ability to write, however you defined it, as they walk out the door. And it was in that moment, in 1979, that I created a portfolio in a writing class that I was teaching. And I thought, at the time, I thought, this is either going to be just fabulous, and it will transfer my learning, or this will be a disaster. It won't be in between. It'll be one or the other. And it turned out, here we are many years later, more than I care to, count. And it turns out that portfolios are, according to the teachers that we have in our NCTE Assessment Story Project, the assessment vehicle of choice. So I'm interested in it because assessment can do so much good, and it's a problem that it does so much bad. And people who know something about it should speak up, because if you speak up, if you look at portfolios, portfolios have been teacher-driven, teacher-generated, teacher-informed right from the beginning. And it may be because of that they haven't gotten the credit that they're due. But that tells you a little something about why I care about it.
Yeah, I think some of my motivation is similar. I'm a classroom teacher, and I'm facing, right after spring break, the looming image of the new standardized achievement tests that are coming our way. And I've seen the impact on our school district, on our curriculum, on our access to the computer labs, how for about 6 weeks, access to computers is going to be shut down so that each grade level can have their turn on the computers to complete the tests. And we're what I like to call a highly resourced district. We have a lot of computers available. I can't imagine how large schools with a small number of computers are surviving. But more importantly, I think even than that for me, is that I have experienced an alternative, which has been high-quality professional learning communities and other teacher study groups and professional conversations around student work, where teachers coming together to look at student work that helps them truly understand what's happening today and leaves them with a learning plan for what they can do differently tomorrow to affect student achievement. And at the same time, it provides it contributes to our professional learning. We get to know literacy growth in a much finer detail than we knew before, because we talk with one another about what counts as evidence that students are growing and learning as readers or writers and learners and language users. And so when you get that payoff of enhanced teaching on the part of the teacher and an enhanced understanding and a more sophisticated lens for assessing students, all because of professional conversations around student work, and the contrast to getting a spreadsheet back that has all these numbers that are reducing complex learning to a small number and trying to spread kids out over a range in order to identify proficient and not proficient. The alternative, when you get faced with both, there's just no contest for a classroom teacher. We know which one is going to help us do a better job in the classroom tomorrow and next year and the year after. So I'm participating in this because I want to speak up and encourage more people to use these more embedded systems of assessment that contribute to student learning and teacher growth.
It's interesting. If I were to do a word analysis of this conversation so far, there are a couple words that keep coming up that I think are so missing from my observation of public conversations around assessment. You're talking so much about progress and growth and process. These words that talk about sort of the messiness of learning and the importance of assessing those things, assessing for observing those things, versus assessments that are looking at this final finished product. What am I at the end? And I wonder if that's kind of core to this whole shift in thinking that has to happen, which is to think about learning as a process as opposed to learning that just gets you to a final product. I wonder if that's part of where the public misconception or the public struggle is happening with assessment, because so much of these assessments we're talking about, even if they do say a school's growth from one year to the next, it's still looking at what happens at the end of each one of those years as opposed to what happens over the course of the year.
You know, for a long time I was caught up in that process versus product conversation, and Carolyn Burke and Kathy Short have a wonderful model that shows that if you're only looking at products, you're missing a huge part of the learning experience. And their model includes looking at student intentions and goals as well as adult goals for those students, looking at process and looking at products and looking at products through the lens of the student, through the lens of other intimate others that are involved on a daily basis with those students, and then looking at products with an outside lens, because there is some value of having someone that doesn't know really anything about the student sort of taking a cold look at their assessment data. But what we've allowed is that one cell of a 9-cell chart to completely overpower all the other cells. It is the only assessment data that we apparently act as if we value, when all those other cells on student evaluation, teacher evaluation of goals, process, and product are so valuable and actually essential to classroom learning.
And I think there's something else here too, which is that the fact that you have an interest in process and that you want to show the relationship between process and a product or process and achievement doesn't mean that you're not interested in achievement. But the wise person, even when you see an achievement, wants to know that you can continue doing what it is that contributed to that. And one of the troubles with the single episode of the assessment is that it doesn't allow you to draw those patterns, to make those correspondences. It doesn't help you understand what you did well. And in fact, that's very interesting, that it's not targeted to what one does well at all. It's targeted to what in the view of the test is not working, but which, as we've indicated, teachers indicate that it's basically what one teacher called a false negative. And so that's a different problem. I think the difficulty with emphasizing process is that I think the public sometimes mistakes that for a teacher's good-hearted intention and an inability or an unwillingness to take, what Kathryn referred to as the cold, hard look. And I don't think those are actually in opposition to each other. I actually think somebody who's very good at tracing process is more likely to help kids achieve than somebody who doesn't have any process or doesn't attend to it. Those belong together, and there's no reason you can't have an assessment vehicle that would bring them together. One of the reasons that people tend to like standardized tests is that they're cheap. And I would simply point out that you get what you pay for. You want a cheap assessment and you want a cheap in learning, you should be really happy because that's what you got.
Good point. Well, we have just 1 minute left, but I'd love to hear from both of you. Imagine that it's 5 years from now and we do this assessment project again. What is something that you could imagine that might be different about stories 5 years from now? And this can be wishful. We can be optimistic here or not.
Go.
One clear difference would be that teachers' voices are valued and central to the ongoing conversations about assessment, and that we are deep in conversations about those rich alternatives that Kathi described, the portfolios, the looking at process and product, and that teachers in schools are spending a lot of time talking about understanding process and product and student learning and student outcomes together, rather than spending a lot of time talking about how do we mitigate the damages of a standardized achievement test and a testing schedule. The other thing I think that we'd be talking about is how better to support professional learning communities and data teams and other teacher conversations. And then finally, that we'd be talking about and celebrating the way teachers' voices are now being recognized in policy decisions that affect day-to-day life in classrooms.
So just to build on that, ditto, all of the above. I can imagine a scenario where in every school district, in every building, on every college campus, a policymaker was saying to a teacher, show us what you see. Mm-hmm. And I think if those kinds of conversations could be invited, it would change the discourse around assessment. I think if you can change the discourse around assessment, and actually, as we've said, change the discourse, then anything is possible. But that's where we'd have to go.
Right. All right, well, I look forward to seeing what it looks like 5 years from now as we continue this journey. Thank you so much, Kathryn and Kathy, for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. And to anybody who's listening or will be listening in the future, this broadcast it has been recorded, so it'll be available via YouTube and then also NCTE's Google Plus page right after we're done tonight. And we invite you to share your stories and your perspectives. Please participate in the Assessment Story Project if you haven't done so already. You can find it on the NCTE blog. Go to blogs.ncte.org, and it'll be the tab at the top that says Assessment Story Project. We'll also make sure that we include that information with the recorded version of this discussion. So thank you again so much, Kathy and Kathryn, for joining us tonight, and thank you to everybody who was tuning in and will be tuning in. Tell your stories. We're learning a lot, and we're going to make sure that we use this information to help us change the conversation through your voices. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.